Good afternoon, everyone. And again, let me add my thanks to having all of you join us here today. My name is Marty Durbin. I'm the Senior Vice President for Policy here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and also the President of the Global Energy Institute. I knew today's event was going to be valuable, but I think for those of you who've been sitting here, it's also been inspirational. And very pleased to have the panel we have with us in front of you to continue the dialogue. Now, as we've heard throughout the day, in order for us to be successful in a recovery for Ukraine's economy and the infrastructure, it's going to take a strong partnership between governments, institutions, and the private sector. Rebuilding critical infrastructure and the energy grid has been identified by many stakeholders as one of the most pressing needs we have. We've heard many times today about the World Bank estimated requiring $400 billion to rebuild Ukraine, and it sure sounds like that could be an underestimate. I know the World Bank has also estimated that 40% of the nation's energy system has either been destroyed or damaged. And to put a few more other statistics on there, I know the Kyiv School of Economics has put out some estimates that just through December of last year, the total damage assessment is about $140 billion. And without going through all of the different categories there, we know that means over 150,000 residential buildings that have been destroyed, 150 bridges and overpasses on important state roads that have all been part of this. So again, I'm honored to have a panel today that can help us address both the critical needs of today and what's necessary for us to rebuild the country at the time we can really lean in and do that. So first, on the far right, we've got Laura Lockman, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of Energy Resources, Department of State. Annie Petzonk, immediately to my right, who is Assistant Secretary for Aviation and International Affairs at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Mark Loughran from Honeywell, is President of Central and Eastern European Affairs. Elisa Newman-Hood, Executive Vice President, General Counsel at Accelerate Energy. And Roger Martella, who's the Chief Sustainability Officer for GE. Thank you all for joining me today. Laura, I wanted to start with you, perhaps ask you to frame the overall energy situation for us. So what does it mean to be providing support to meet the urgent needs of today, repairing and strengthening the existing system, all while looking ahead at the long-term needs, and so how do we manage all of those different aspects in tandem?
Thank you very much, Marty. Thank you for having all of us here today. And I appreciate the question. Certainly for Ukraine as well as for the international community, it's going to be critical that we do address these multiple priorities simultaneously. And at the offset, I would like to point to where we are now in the energy sector, of course, was fundamentally affected by what started in October of last year with the barrage, the brutal attack on infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, by Russian missiles and drones. And the Ukrainians showed immense courage and ability to get through the winter without any long-term degradation of critical services such as power, heat, water provision. It took a lot of ingenuity and courage to do that. And particularly since October of last year, from the US government perspective, we have been mobilized as an interagency, the Department of State, the US Agency for International Development, Department of Energy, and others, working with our Ukrainian partners and with the international financial institutions to try to assist with critical materials, critical pieces of infrastructure that were necessary to stabilize the grid and to keep it going through the winter. So we're all very relieved that this winter is over, but as you said, the estimate is that the grid is at least 40% degraded. It could be even up to 50%. So while now we're in the spring, we have 6 months in which to prepare for next winter. And there's still much work that needs to be done to fortify the existing system, prepare it for next winter. And a big piece of that is auto transformers, as many people on the stage and in the audience know. And those are very difficult, timely to produce and to transport and get in place in Ukraine. So our USAID has been in the process of procuring 15 of these units. Other international donors have been providing some as well, but Ukraine needs over 60, and we're definitely not there. So we need to keep moving on those fronts. At the same time, the Ukrainians are setting out a vision for the long term, and we are following the Ukrainians' lead in terms of that vision, which is for a more decentralized, greener, more Europe-focused, European connected grid with more distributed generation, able to withstand any stresses. That's the long-term future that's envisioned. And so we are working with the G7+, not only on the immediate term, but also preparing for supporting with that longer vision. How do we enable the Ukrainians to meet their goals under that vision?
Thank you. Annie, if I could kind of pose a similar question to you, but as kind of outline the transportation infrastructure challenges and how we're preparing for the recovery on that front.
So as our Secretary Pete Buttigieg says, we see the transportation challenges for Ukraine on 3 levels. First, the ensuring the provision of immediate assistance. That's both in the military and non-military, and the humanitarian side, as USAID and partners are doing so much to make sure that assistance is flowing. I just returned from Rzeszów in Eastern Poland, close to the border, and saw some of the challenges in that transportation infrastructure there to keep that humanitarian assistance going. The second challenge is keeping the core elements of Ukraine's economy functioning during wartime. That means the grain. The grain exports through the Black Sea have been sharply curtailed. We now face the challenge, Ukraine is facing the challenge of getting the grain by other means, whether it's by truck, which is quite complicated, or by rail, in which case you're dealing with the Ukrainian wider gauge rail linking up to the European narrower gauge rail and all the challenges that entails. And so the various elements of the Ukrainian economy and the role that transportation plays now during wartime, keeping that going. And I really want to salute not only all of the people who've spoken here today from Ukraine, but the rail workers who are doing so much now to keep the people of Ukraine and the economy of Ukraine moving. And the third level is the reconstruction. And that's the bigger challenge, the more, as Mustafa said so eloquently this morning, it's immediate and it's long-term, and it requires really very broad partnerships. We have been coordinating with the Europeans on the solidarity lanes. Now we need to have much broader coordination through the G7+ and others, and our international financial institutions in terms of that broad reconstruction and the role that transportation will play, where they need to replace not only the bridges, as you pointed out, but roads, get the airports up and running again, all of those elements of the transportation infrastructure.
Thank you, Annie. Appreciate that. Elisa, I wanted to perhaps shift a little bit right now from more of the electric grid. Had a lot of discussion with the critical role that natural gas has played in Ukraine and throughout Europe, of course. And of course, accelerates core business is LNG terminals that are using FSRUs. So first, I'd just like to ask you to explain to everybody what is an FSRU and what's the role that they're playing in helping to provide the security the energy security for Ukraine and the region.
Thanks, Marty. Well, sure, I'll start by spelling out the acronym. So for those who aren't aware, though I have to say I've noticed post-Ukraine crisis, there is definitely a lot more knowledge and understanding of what FSRUs are and what they do. But FSRU is a floating storage and regasification unit. In other words, it is a vessel that is moored offshore a country that can be used to import liquefied natural gas, or LNG. Its close cousin, the onshore LNG terminal, import terminal, as you can imagine, is more capital intensive. Unlike an FSRU, it's not pre-built. So it takes obviously then more funds and more time to develop an onshore project. And onshore projects tend to, as you would expect by definition, have a large land footprint. And both kinds of terminals, whether an FSRU or an onshore terminal, are in turn, of course, an alternative to pipeline gas. So Accelerate has been in the FSRU business for about 20 years, and in every region of the world except Europe. So we have FSRUs until recently. FSRUs in North and South America, including in the United States, in Boston actually, or we have had and in some cases still do have, in South America, in South Asia, in the Middle East. But it was really only the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the ensuing crisis, energy crisis, that really catalyzed European governments, as I'm sure many in this room know, to think about and focus on alternatives to Russian pipeline gas for their own energy security. So since the start of the Ukraine crisis, so since in just about the past year, we've been approached by the governments of Finland and Estonia for one project, and then from the German government for another, and we've since chartered FSRUs to those countries. So in terms of what FSRUs can do for Ukraine specifically, I should mention there are a number of geopolitical factors that actually predate the crisis, most relating to the difficulty of shipping LNG through the Bosphorus, that make it probably unlikely that Ukraine would be able to moor an FSRU offshore. But Ukraine can still benefit from the technology by its neighbors, and Poland in particular, in bringing in FSRUs, thereby increasing the gas in the region, which then can arrive in Ukraine via pipelines. I guess maybe just as a last point, I would note that looking sort of at Ukraine's energy sector and its energy mix, is when it comes to power generation, there are alternatives to natural gas. I mean, there are less, let's say, environmentally friendly things such as coal, which Ukraine does rely on. Obviously, nuclear, renewables, about 10% of Ukraine's power mix is from renewables, as well as domestic and imported natural gas. So that's for power generation. But when it comes to heating, 80% of Ukrainian homes are heated by natural gas, and there really is, at present, no short, medium, or really even long-term alternative to that.
I think what you're pointing out is the importance of those regional interconnections around there, and we'll come back to that point with some of the other panelists as well. But Roger, I wanted to move to you, and we were talking beforehand about the experience GE is having in country today, and what you're doing. And I think it'd be important for you to kind of paint the picture of what it is you're doing there with your partners, and perhaps discussing what some of the priorities and needs are for both for the partners there, the donor community, and how the private sector is playing a role.
Marty, thank you, and thank you to the Chamber for its leadership today. I agree with you. It's been an inspirational day and an important group of stakeholders to reinforce at this moment that we're really at the beginning of this effort, and we need to be committed as ever. It goes without saying, energy is really the lifeblood of our society. It's critical to live a prosperous life. Kids need energy to feel safe, to have access to health care, job opportunities. And GE helps provide 1/3 of the world's energy in 170 countries. So if something's going to challenge people's access to energy, we take that seriously. It's personal to us. From our CEO all the way down to our frontline workers. And so we've looked at Ukraine and said there's few things we're doing that's more important than making sure we're being supportive in Ukraine with our partners who you see here on the stage. And so we've been proud. One of our successes so far, again, in partnership with USAID, with the State Department, which I hope we can get into, unparalleled public-private partnership. Earlier this year, we shipped something called a TM2500. It's basically, imagine a jet engine connected to a generator stuck on top of a truck bed. So you can see the strategy there. Generates about 26 megawatts, enough to power 100,000 homes, use it in very strategic ways. And it's the first of many to come, but reinforces our commitment, our partnership to make sure that we're helping those kids keep the lights on and that we're supporting Ukraine in this time. I agree with what the Assistant Secretary said. I think one of the unsung successes for Ukraine is as Their grid has been targeted. I think something like 40% of their grid has been targeting. How they got through the winter, how they kept the lights on, and we've been happy to work with and honored to work with the Ministry of Energy, and just seeing how you have these energy secretaries working like wartime generals in that kind of mindset to keep this lifeblood of energy to their people. So Marty, we see three things on the horizon. One is the need for emergency power. Very happy, a sense of relief. We got through the winter, but we know the challenges are still ahead, so we can't take that for granted. We have to be thinking of what are the contingencies, what are the scenarios, where can we help mobilize equipment where they need it the most in terms of what might be happening in the near term and the longer term. The second is the theme you've heard of rebuilding. I think this scenario of railroad tracks is so relevant to how we think of the grid. We have a fundamental reconstruction issue where it's a Russian-built grid that works in a Russian way. They want to move to a European-style grid with a more clean energy opportunity and build it in a European way. It's like connecting the two disparate railroad tracks. That's a really good analogy of what we're doing. So while that's a little more down the road, the planning begins today. The planning has already begun because there's significant lead times. We heard about auto transformers and just making sure we can be ready when needed so we can hit the ground running. And then the third part I'd say about this is how do we make sure beyond just delivering equipment, how do we make sure that they benefit from the new energy economy, from the clean energy economy? How can we be talking about them exporting equipment, exporting energy? How can we be building factories that enable Ukrainians to be building this equipment, to be part of the supply chain, and to having those economic opportunities where they're contributing these issues more globally? So that, I think, is probably the most fun part of this in early days, but already pursuing some ideas on how Ukraine's economy can be part of the solution, part of the future, how its people can be part of the manufacturing and supply chain.
Excellent. No, I appreciate that, Roger. I think it just keeps reinforcing the level of courage and resiliency that the Ukrainian people have showed throughout all of this, but also gives you a great deal of optimism about to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that are out there. So Mark, I know you are in the region. You've got long experience in the region as well, and of course you're now with a company that's involved in just about every different part of the energy industry and the energy sector. So I wanted, as part of the pivot here on where are we going from here, perhaps ask you to address what has to happen, to meet the enormous challenge of transferring, resources and energy and materials, both to meet the existing structural needs today, but then to, start the planning for that rebuild that's coming.
In a way, your question's about what's possible, what needs to be done. And I think what we've heard today, if we just recognize the heroes that we've been talking about, I think anything is possible, but it needs to be planned for. But just a word on the heroes, the military heroes, incredible the situation that we're now in. And Slava Ukraina, and let's hope and believe that the war will come to an end soon with a victory. You talked about the railways. The railway heroes, those of you who have been in and out of Kiev or Lviv, and if you haven't, I invite you to go do that. You will see the heroes on the railways, even with the system that they're running today, and imagine what that can be like in the future. And both of you talked about what's happened in the energy sector. It is remarkable. It is purely remarkable how the wartime generals in the energy sector got through the winter. I was in Kiev meeting with the ministry, meeting with a number of the different leaders of the energy companies just after when those attacks happened. And remember, they weren't, the physical attacks were terrible. You could see that. But also there was the cyber attack. So there was two ways that those people were under attack. And what they did to overcome that, I think, has given me incredible belief in what's able to be possible. But now when we look to the future, these are long-term infrastructure projects, and energy covers a lot of different parts. And I think the most important next step, yes, there's the planning for next winter, you're absolutely right, that needs to be done, it would be critical. The other side of it is to start to make the decisions of what the future looks like. It's clearly imperative that Ukraine is fully connected to the European grid and able to sell into the European grid. You heard from the Minister of Economy earlier on today how important that was. You're talking about maybe 50 million, 60 million, $70 million a month that the Ukrainian system can earn from that. And that can all go back into reconstruction. So massive opportunity there. The decisions have to be made about the construct of that, about the massive amount of materials that are going to be needed. A lot of that, there's supply chains. Those supply chains may take 18 months. Exactly what everything. So I think this moment of, can you hear me now? Okay, I'm back. So I think in conclusion, what's super important to be done is making the decisions about how the future will look, the balance between the different types of sustainable solutions and the other solutions for energy that's going to be in place, and starting to work out the technical details, because this will allow the supply chains to be put together, and then the investment in the people and the capabilities and the competencies.
Excellent. And Mark, thank you for your resilience of being able to deal with the different microphones here. Laura, I wanted to come back to you and talk about digging a little deeper on these regional interconnections that are so critical, and help us understand the shifts that are underway. Clearly we've already seen a shift kind of west to east to west, as far as energy flows and others as well. And just to help us understand a little bit more about that and what that's going to mean for creating that vibrant and growing economy and integrated with Europe.
Thank you for that. Yes, as we've all pointed out, energy is obviously a fundamental element of economic recovery and prosperity going forward anywhere, and we're talking about Ukraine, obviously. But I agree with what some alluded to, which is the potential in Ukraine for not only providing its own domestic resources for its growth, but also being really an energy powerhouse for the European region. The elements are there in terms of, we talked about the nuclear, the natural gas, biomass. There's renewables that are already being put in place, and plans for much greater deployment of renewables. And all of this is very important, again, not only to Ukraine, but in the entire region, in strengthening that European energy security that has been threatened by the actions of Russia. And in that regard, the interconnections are extremely important. There are obviously some already in place, and if we're looking at electricity, there is electricity trade going on now between Ukraine and the European system. And that was due to an emergency synchronization that happened just prior to the start of the war last year. And Ukraine, at this very moment, given the fact that it's now warmer weather and they don't have as much need, they're exporting some today to Europe through the INSO-E system. So having that back and forth and that integration is critical. And right now it's just at a very small, minimal level. So that needs to grow, and that will happen with infrastructure investment, obviously, in Ukraine, and with adoption, continued adoption of European norms and standards, getting corporate governance as well as regulations and the legal side up to par with OECD and European standards, and that will help attract that private sector investment that you will all be looking at to build up the infrastructure to the point where we can realize that potential for Ukraine in the future.
I wanted to get your thoughts as well on what it will take to get to pull in the private sector engagement and the investment that is necessary.
As several speakers this morning emphasized, transparency will be critical. And Mustafa put forward a really important challenge, and I think it's worth going into that challenge for a quick moment. When we say transparency, what specifically do we mean? The American taxpayers and the U.S. Congress entrusted the U.S. Department of Transportation with $500 billion to spend under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act to distribute to our regions in the United States, to our communities, with priorities for transparency, sustainability, equity across the board, promoting economic growth with quality infrastructure and always with safety as our North Star. We're eager to share from a technical perspective what those pieces of infrastructure transparency requirements and the way that we've organized it in the Department of Transportation in coordination with states, localities, and bringing in the private sector. And we think that that kind of experience can be very helpful at this critical time for Ukraine, as during the middle of a war, it is attempting to bring those forward. And I also wanted to highlight something that Andrew Torrey mentioned this morning, and that is and that Mustafa also mentioned, the digital infrastructure undergirding that. It's going to be critical for the private sector to be able to participate in this reconstruction in a way where efforts are not duplicated and there's not conflicting norms and priorities. And that means a level of digital coordination that is really quite large in terms of what's going to be needed. And to me, it's very exciting that our counterparts in Ukraine, the colleagues at the Ministry of Infrastructure and Regions, and the other colleagues in other ministries are so keen on making that happen and making it work in a way that works for the private sector.
Excellent, thank you. Well, I'd like to ask a similar question of our three private sector panelists here as well. I know a lot of the funding that's going to be coming through will be tied to international grants and loans, but what's going to be needed to then be able to leverage the private sector capital to make sure that the resources are there? So Roger, why don't I start with you?
One of the lessons I think we've learned already, which has been really remarkable, I mean, where do businesses thrive? What does the Chamber of Commerce stand for? We thrive in areas of certainty, right? We like to take on the challenges, but businesses thrive in certainty. So what do we have in Ukraine? We have a war-torn environment where we're trying to move things, very complicated, heavy machinery and other sophisticated things in a tough infrastructure environment as quickly as possible. It's kind of the antithesis to the environments where we thrive, which is certainty. So what has happened and what's enabled us to be successful there, which I think is a real transformation, it's really this theme of this public-private partnership. It's been the theme of the day, but it's really been the enabler for us, because what has happened is the government, USAID, the State Department, they have de-risked as much as they can for us. They have made our life easier so we can focus on what we do best, which is building and delivering and operating equipment. And the government has focused kind of what on it does best, which is here de-risking the environment, making some of these complex logistics that even a company like GE can't solve for, taking that off our plate. And that's enabled, frankly, me to go to our leaders, to our board, and say, this is something we can do. This is something we need to prioritize, even at the expense of some other things. So this precedent for public-private partnership, which I think in our situation in Ukraine, the best I've seen in my career. I don't think we're seeing a lot of evolution that way, but the strongest I've seen, that's going to be the key to de-risking all this uncertainty, trying to create certainty as much as we can in this very challenging environment. And I think it's not only a lesson for Ukraine, I think this is a lesson as we go ahead in the energy transition, as we look to be more nimble in places where vulnerable people are being impacted by climate change, where they need more resiliency, more durability in this grid. I really think we're creating a model today. I know our number one problem is Ukraine, but we're creating a model today for how to do that more broadly. So it's a really exciting time, frankly, to be at the leading edge of this and to be working so closely together with our partners to kind of solve some of these really hard challenges.
Roger, I couldn't agree with you more about using the opportunity to help build the trust and the confidence among all these different players here, and also building muscle memory so that we can apply it in other places. But getting back to the item at hand today, Elisa, let me ask you your thoughts on the same question.
Sure. Well, I think I'll answer actually by tying your question on regional cooperation to this question, because I think that actually the answers are similar. So I think Ukraine can definitely benefit from perhaps the better credit right now and greater stability of its neighbors, and take advantage of that, again, to help ensure its own energy security. Ukraine benefits from really strong pipeline connections with a number of its neighbors. I'll focus my comments on natural gas because that's what I know. But there is an existing pipeline from Poland to Ukraine via Slovakia. There is a pipeline in the works that would bring gas directly from Gdansk in Poland to Ukraine. So as Ukraine's neighbors, like I'll use Poland as an example, look to bring in more gas. So Poland is looking to expand its existing LNG terminal at Świnoujście. and is also looking to and has announced plans to build a new LNG import terminal at Gdansk, which would use 1 or possibly 2 FSRUs. This is all gas that can ultimately make its way to Ukraine, where a lot of the infrastructure, however, is financed by neighbors. And I would say I do think there are also synergies, and Ukraine can return the favor, so to speak, particularly in that Ukraine has more than 30 billion cubic meters of gas storage, 10 of which is currently unused. So again, there's just a lot of win-wins, and I think great opportunities for regional collaboration that then, to your second question, gives confidence in addition to what we're looking for from IFC and DFC and the multilateral and bilateral financing agencies, but that gives private sector companies the confidence that investing, yes, in Ukraine, but also in the region.
Excellent. To your point about the resources in country, I learned this morning from one of our attendees that there are today still, I think, 30 operating drilling rigs for producing gas. So again, just about the resilience of Ukraine to continue providing for itself, in addition to everyone being able to partner with them as well. Mark?
Yeah, I think for me, it's clear that the business case is going to be there, because you're asking about what it's going to take to make the investment and to do the project. So I think that for me is clear. I think the part that now needs to do the hard yards I'm working on is, what are those projects going to be? What are the technical specifications of those? And I also think, therefore, what is the mode of procurement? We heard on one of the earlier panels that discussion, the direct negotiation to the full open tender, and there's a whole number of different solutions in between, talking about highly complex, highly technical projects. So, to move fast, there's probably going to have to be some kind of direct negotiation and discussion around those technical specs with a small number of very experienced companies. And then obviously as it expands, it can go to the wider tenders. So I think getting to that point will then allow us to invest both the time and energy and resources, even into the negotiation process, into the technical specification process. I mean, the amount of people, time, and effort it takes even to construct it and even to describe it is absolutely enormous. That can take 12 to 18 months in itself. So that's the first investment. And then it's actually when everything's deployed. So, I think the sooner we start to get to those discussions, I think that will then allow us to start to make a real difference on the ground. And as I said in my previous answer, the clean energy part, the sustainable part, is going to be really important. Yes, for Ukraine itself, but to be able to export it into the European Union, that's going to be a key differentiator and a key criteria that it's going to need to be the clean energy solutions. So that has to be thought through, that has to be planned at the kind of scale that's going to make a difference to then bringing the return for the country, which then they can reinvest in their own redevelopment and recovery.
Mark, as a quick follow-up, do you feel those conversations are taking place, or starting to take place, or is there still some more structure around there? I know we've heard talk about working with USAID and Department of State and elsewhere, but
I'd start to answer that in the way I answered it the first time. Incredible heroes doing incredible stuff. There are a lot of individual projects. There's incredible innovation. And remember, in energy, it's the hardware, but it's also the software. The digital capability, as you discussed, is outstanding. And, the digital capability is also needed. So there's lots and lots of pockets and lots of examples and people doing some good stuff. So that's great. I think for the longer-term solution, it has to be very, very much planned. How much is going to be hydrogen in 10 years' time, and what does that mean for the pipelines, and what does that mean for the infrastructure? How much will be nuclear, and where do you put that? If it's wind farms, So lots and lots of really good stuff, but there's got to be a bigger, let's call it, master plan that then will allow the larger scale transformation, which will then bring the real big benefits. But for that, we're talking, a 10-year plan.
Sure.
Yeah, not the short-term plan.
Laura, I think it's a good segue to maybe to ask you to pick up on that and a couple of other themes we've heard, not just the regional interconnections, but I understand there was a meeting of the US-EU Energy Task Force this week as well. I can't imagine this wasn't part of the big part of the conversation, but also kind of weaving in Roger's point about here's an opportunity to build a model for yes, what we could use here, we can use elsewhere. So kind of an open-ended question for you here, but I'd love to get your thoughts.
Thank you for that. Yes, we had our US-EU Energy Council meeting in Brussels last week, and this was a primary topic of conversation, but it's ongoing. Right. And one of the great lessons learned through this process, Roger was talking about how this is developing to be an excellent example of the public-private partnership model, and we have also seen that a mechanism like the G7+, which incorporates so many of our allies and partners, but also the international financial institutions, the development finance institutions, that mechanism has also proved to be really effective in at least meeting, again, the immediate term. We have amazing numbers. The G7+ has provided more than 4,000 power generators, 1,000 transformers, and more than 5,000 pieces of equipment like circuit breakers and other things to the grid just since October. And obviously, we will stay with this as long as we need to in terms of these emergency efforts. But the shift we all need to make now is to figure out how to take that mechanism and combine it with others, broader mechanisms, to figure out how to define and move towards that future. And we're relying again on our Ukrainian counterparts to define. They're now defining the vision, but from that has to stem a unified strategic plan, and then the specific lines of action under that. So while they are taking the lead, obviously we're all there to support in any way we can, and with technical assistance, with recommendations, with ideas, and then with help from our private sectors. So that's kind of where we are now. Events like this, and then moving into the June Reconstruction Conference in London, these are helping us all get our heads around where we need to go at this point.
Excellent, thank you. Roger, I wonder if I can ask you, we'll bring it back to today. I was really impressed to hear earlier panels. We had Andy from the AmCham and the Deputy Environment Minister outlining how despite what we all see on the news every night, the economy's operating. Companies are there. There are companies that are building new plants. Now, again, obviously critical needs there, but day to day, what do you see? What more is needed for the short-term needs that they have, and how is that working?
I think there's two things. One is the lesson we're still learning, that we've been really optimistic up here, and I want to be optimistic. I think we should be. We're still learning a lesson, and that's really goes to the supply chain. There's been a little thing that's come through the conversation today, but this has really been a wake-up call, not only for Ukraine, but I think for all of us, that we don't have these auto transformers sitting on shelves. When we deliver TM2500 to Ukraine, these are in such high demand to solve problems all around the world. We have to go to our customers and say, hey, can we do a scavenger hunt? Maybe you can wait a little bit because we think it's more important in Ukraine. It has been a wake-up call that we need to be thinking about our supply chain. We need to be planning in advance and being very strategic in anticipating all kinds of challenges to the grid, whether in Ukraine or elsewhere, so we can be nimble and ready. I think because of this partnership, we feel, and the great work by Ukraine, we feel very good about where we are right now, but we may not be ready the next time. And so I think we're working very closely together to think about how can we, reconstruction is going to take years. We may not really get started on that phase until we all want to do it as soon as possible later, but what do we need to be doing today to plan for that 2, 3, 4-year horizon? Start placing those orders, getting the people working in factories. Can we even be building factories in Ukraine to do that today? The other point I'd make quickly is we talked about public-private partnership. If we're going to succeed, you need more than that. You need public, 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 private, 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 and so on. Even a company as big as GE cannot do this. We have one part of this chain. We need to partner with Honeywell. We need to partner with Bechtel. We need to partner with all these agencies here in Europe, the G7, and beyond, knowing that we have to come together in a coordinated way. And what each of us can do best and bring that whole together. So I think we have some more work to do there too. I think we're like doing a good job of putting out kind of the fires of today, but when we think longer term and what's best, we do need more coordination, I think, among the broader public sector, the broader private sector. There's plenty of work here for everybody. Let's be clear on that. There's no monopoly in the work, but let's do it in a really thoughtful way that makes this a real success.
Sounds like job security for many of us in the room here. So, no, thank you, Roger. Annie, so I want to come back to you and maybe give a sense of, or give us a sense of the role DOT plays. I mean, you think about, we were talking about an international goal, Department of State, Department of Commerce, but Department of Transportation. What's the, where do you guys fit in, and where should people in this room be thinking about engaging with the department?
So first, just a little bit of background. The office that I lead is the Office of Aviation and International Affairs in the department. When Congress broke up the old Civil Aeronautics Board, it split the aviation responsibilities. The safety and security responsibilities are with the Federal Aviation Administration, with whom we work very, very closely on a 24-hour basis. And then my office, which is which handles the economic regulation of aviation. So permissions for foreign carriers to fly to the United States, agreements between the United States and other countries about aviation, and the licensing of domestic carriers. Our office also leads and is responsible for coordinating all of the department's international engagements across all of the modes of transportation that the department covers, and including the Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, PHMSA. And so the department works with counterparts on in a whole bunch of different negotiations, including a number of negotiations very relevant for Ukraine's infrastructure rebuilding, and those are including standards negotiations. And I'll just give one example. A number of our colleagues here have referred to Ukraine's interest in rebuilding in a way that is sustainable going forward. The transformation that we are starting to see in our nation, in our transportation infrastructure, including the shift to electric cars that's happening here, will be happening in other parts of the world. And if Ukraine wants to go in that direction, both the technical expertise and the standards become very important. And in those negotiations, for example, our National Highway Transportation Safety Administration leads for the United States in something called WP29, not to get too technical about it, but that's the UN working group that works out the standards in this field. Those standards are important not only to ensure that US companies have an opportunity to compete, but also that the safety standards, the security standards, and the cybersecurity standards for electric vehicle integration are worked out and are robust. So our technical expertise, as I mentioned, in terms of administering federal procurements in the very important challenge that Ukraine is facing in dealing with requests from all over the country, from every region in the country, every town in the country, all of the different projects requesting support. How do you coordinate that? How do you prioritize in that? And how do you ensure the flow of funds in a transparent way? Those are all things that our department has been deeply engaged in over the past, it's our bread and butter.
Great. Well, thank you. That's very helpful. And the point about EVs, what is that going to mean to the grid load in country and need for materials and what have you? We're coming down close to the end here, so Lisa, I wanted to let you and Mark have an opportunity to make some final remarks, wrapping things up here.
Sure. Well, I'd definitely like to piggyback on Roger on your comments about supply chain, because it's my view is that if this crisis has taught us 10 lessons about supply chain, it's taught us 100 lessons about the need for redundancy. And I think these are also, these concepts are interlinked. All the European governments that relied exclusively on Russian pipeline gas have now, and very ably and with a lot of agility, have pivoted to build redundancy and alternatives into their systems. And one might think that Ukraine just trying to sort of plug a hole and fill a very immediate need would not have the luxury of thinking about redundancy, but in fact, in our conversations with Ukrainian officials, we're finding that they also have the foresight to be thinking about how to build redundancy into their energy sources. In fact, we met about a month ago with Energy Minister Galushenko, and I liked what he said so much I actually wrote it down. It's just a sentence. He says that spare energy infrastructure is necessary to avoid vulnerability and to overcome market fluctuations, monopolies, and geopolitical threats.
Excellent. Mark?
Look, I think we took energy for granted. I don't think we understood really where it was coming from and why and what, and I think we understand that now. We understand energy can be a blessing, but also it can be a weapon. And I think now, when we're talking about sovereignty of Ukraine, sovereignty of Europe, I think we now understand that energy sovereignty is absolutely critical to that. And something that's become really clear to me, I didn't understand this 2 years ago. Sustainable energy solutions are, yes, about helping the planet, but actually those sustainable solutions mixed with the natural solutions that you have allow you to have sovereign energy sources on your own land, within your own borders. And I think this is the incredible opportunity that there is in Ukraine. We heard a lot of comments, build back better. I think actually this building back with these sustainable sovereign solutions, which also will be able to be exported to the rest of Europe, I think that's going to be incredible and an inspiration from the heroes of Ukraine.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. I love that you both started and ended on the heroes, because I think we can't keep them out of our minds here on this. We've seen a group here. We recognize the challenge that's ahead of us, but also are optimistic about the opportunities. And again, appreciate all of you being here and being part of the conversation. And please join me in thanking our panelists.